Hey everyone, thanks for watching. Today I'll be making a sliding Deadman to install to my Roubo style workbench. Originally I wasn't planning on adding this feature to my workbench, but over the last couple of months I've found a few instances where it'd be nice to have the Deadman to support long boards when hand planing, and it's a quick easy project, so I figured I'd just knock it out. Just like the rest of the workbench, I'm using Southern Yellow Pine. I'll start by measuring out and cutting the rough length of the Deadman. The support slides on a track that'll be glued to the front rail of my workbench, and here I'm just measuring out and cutting the board that I'll make the track out of. Over at the joiner I'll square up two faces of the boards, and then I'll take them over to the table saw and start by ripping the support to its final width. Then I can head over to the workbench and flatten the final face of the support with my hand planes. I could use my planer for this, but just felt like using some hand tools. To create the V-shaped groove at the bottom of the support, I'll start by finding center of the board with my marking gauge, and then come back with my square and mark out two 45s. Next I'll head over to the table saw, tilt my blade over to a 45-degree angle, and use my miter gauge to support the board through the cut. The V-groove doesn't have to be absolutely perfect, so I'll just use my eye to roughly align the blade with the marks that I made earlier. Next I can mark out and cut the part that's going to be the track that the Deadman slides in. I'll create the same marks using my square on the board, but the V in obviously the opposite direction, and then use my table saw at the same 45-degree angle to make the cuts. To make sure no sharp edges ride against each other and that the Deadman slides back and forth nice and easy, I'm going to create a flat on the top of the track that I just cut out. Now I can set my table saw back up at 90 degrees and cut the track away from the rest of the board. Over at the workbench I can roughly put the Deadman and track in its place and then mark out where I think the tenon needs to be for the top of the Deadman. And once I got a couple of rough markings, I'll come back and finish marking out the rest of the tenon. Then after everything's marked out, it just takes a couple of passes over at the table saw to cut away all the waste. Next I decided to change gears a little bit while I had some extra muscle and flip the workbench over so I could start working on the channel that the Deadman would slide in. This is the part of the build where I realized it would have been nice to add this feature when I was building the bench originally, or at least to route out the channel in case I was going to do it later. But once I got the bench flipped over, it was just a matter of setting up my router with a 1/2 inch bit and then cutting a 3/4 inch wide groove down by 1 inch deep. And then I just did this by making multiple passes really light, so I didn't risk the router jumping and tearing out the front of my workbench. Now I can come back to the sliding Deadman and cut the tenon or the shoulder to just under a 1 inch length. The Deadman's just around 7.5 inches wide, and I'm just marking in 2 inches on each side for 2 rows of dog holes, but you could easily do another row in the middle if you wanted the offsets to be a little closer together and have more options for supporting long boards. And here I'm just marking out the dog hole locations. I drilled one of the holes first and then went back and spaced all the other holes accordingly. I'm using a 3/4 inch spade bit to drill the holes, so I'll set the depth of that bit to just poke through the bottom of the board, but not enough to where the whole bit comes through. This way I'll reduce some tear out. I can drill in from one side, flip the sliding Deadman over, see the pilot holes that are left, and then use those to drill in from the other side, and that should give me a nice clean cut. Once all the holes are drilled, I'll add some shape to the sliding Deadman just so it doesn't look so blocky. All I did was mark down a couple inches on each side, draw out a couple simple arcs, and head over to the bandsaw to make the cuts. Once I have the profiles roughed out, I'll head over to the workbench and use my spoke shave and rasp to clean up all the bandsaw marks. I'll go over the whole Deadman with my smoothing plane just to remove any nicks and scratches or pencil marks that would be left over. I wanted to create a chamfer and ease all the edges of the Deadman, so I used a small file to do this. And then when I was finished, I went over the whole piece with a 220 grit sandpaper and my sanding block. Then to make it easier to slide the dogs into the holes and to keep any kind of chip out or tear out from happening, I rounded over all the edges of the dog holes with a small file. The track's going to be glued down to the front stretcher of my workbench, so I'm just using some 120 grit paper to rough up the surface to let the glue adhere better. And here I'm applying some glue to the bottom of the track. It would have probably been easier to add the glue to the top of the stretcher, and it wouldn't have made such a mess. One note here is that if you don't want the sliding Deadman to be a permanent fixture to the workbench, you could take and just put the track down with screws and not glue it down like I'm doing here. But I want mine to be a permanent fixture, so I'll just use the glue. I'll take the sliding Deadman and stick the top tenon into its track, and then stick the bottom track onto the V-groove and slide the whole assembly onto the stretcher. And once I have everything in place, then I'll come back and apply a bunch of clamps. I'll apply them evenly and try to make sure that the track doesn't slide one way or the other. I want both edges of the track to sit flush with the bottom stretcher. Then I'll come back with a rag and clean out all the glue squeeze out. I'll try to make sure to get no glue on the track so that the Deadman slides back and forth nice and easy. Once the glue's dried overnight, I'll remove the clamps and then come back and apply some boiled linseed oil to the Deadman and the track, just to make it match the rest of the workbench. And that's it, this project's done. This was a nice feature to add to my workbench and a great easy project to build. I only wish that I would have done it sooner, maybe when I was assembling the workbench in the beginning. But it's nice to have. I like using it to support these long boards, and it's a lot easier than running a clamp from one end of the bench to the other. That's what I was doing before to hold long boards in place. And if I have an odd shaped board, I can use my Veritas hold down, and other than that I use the bench dogs that are already installed on the top of the workbench. So I hope you guys liked this video, and if you did, give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching.